to... Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Scott Paulson. So glad you're joining us here at Ether Tale Radio Theater on WSRadio.com. Perhaps you tuned in early and heard our very professional sound check, and you heard the wonderful voice of Barbara Henderson. Barbara Henderson, are you still there?
I'm still here, Scott.
And I can see you, so again, I'm grateful. And Melanie Peters, are you with us as well?
Sadly, I'm still here.
No, not sadly at all. I'm so glad you are here. And we're here in the beautiful studios and near the fancy white Pyramid of Doom on Miramar Road. Just right nearby there. And here at Ether Tale Radio Theater, we often do live radio dramas and often read stories. And today there's no gimmicks, no bells or whistles. We're just going to read some wonderful selections of books that are being considered for the Great American Read. And that's a program that PBS is doing. Soon, later in May, they'll start broadcasting on television episodes where a celebrity will talk about a particular book that they think is entitled to be in the running for the Great American Read, sort of a book club for our country. And there are about 100 books, well, exactly 100 books being considered, from the sublime to the less sublime. Well, I was so delighted to see that Frankenstein, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, was on the list because we're soon celebrating the bicentennial of that book. And so that's great. Surprised to see some others, but I guess it makes sense. I guess it makes sense that 50 Shades of Grey made the cut because it got people excited about reading and reading a book that wasn't a television show and wasn't a movie. They actually read a book. No surprise that Harry Potter was there to get children excited about reading and families just as excited to read with them. Some surprises and some not so much surprises. Tonight, Barbara and Melanie and I have picked a couple books that we want to read excerpts from. Maybe we'll mention why we're glad that it's in the running for the Great American Read. Miss Melanie,
Yes.
What book have you got before you there? It's green.
Yes, it's a rather awful olive green.
and somebody really scribbled in it. It wasn't you, I know. And that's a library book, too.
It was not me. I chose for my first selection Pride and Prejudice. And one of the reasons I chose it was, well, it's just a delightful, wonderful book that I've read several times. But every time I read it, it's like I'm reading it for the first time again. But as I was paging through the book, I loved all the marginalia. So there's little notations on to the side. This person likes stars. There's a lot of starred paragraphs. And it really took me back to the days when I was studying for my English literature degree, and all of my novels were very lovingly and desperately sometimes marked up.
But those were your personal books, not library books.
My personal books,
That's
not
right.
library books. But
in fact, there have been people who have asked to borrow, and you had to say no because that was all your research.
That was all my research. And, people would ask me, oh, well, what are you reading that you love? And I'd be like, oh, you have to read this book. Oh, well, can I borrow your copy? No, you can't. Because, yes, it was my research, but also just unreadable to somebody else because I'd underlined it so much and writing things on the side and cramped writing. But that just makes the book more precious to me.
And I think you're reading the first chapter for us.
I am. I feel that this is, to start off the evening, I should start out with chapter 1.
Very good. But could you go all the way back to the title page and tell us who the author is as well?
I will go all the way back to the title page. Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen.
Thank you, Miss Melanie. Chapter 1.
Chapter 1. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. However little known the feelings or views of such a man may be on his first entering a neighborhood, this truth is so well fixed in the minds of the surrounding families that he is considered as the rightful property of someone or other of their daughters. "My dear Mr. Bennet," said his lady to him one day, "have you heard that Netherfield Park is let at last?" Mr. Bennet replied that he had not. "But it is," returned she, "for Mrs. Long has just been here, and she told me all about it." Mr. Bennet made no answer. Do not you want to know who has taken it?" cried his wife impatiently. "You want to tell me, and I have no objection to hearing it." This was invitation enough. "Why, my dear, you must know. Mrs. Long says that Netherfield is taken by a young man of large fortune from the north of England, that he came down on Monday in a chaise and four to see the place, and was so much delighted with it that he agreed with Mr. Morris immediately that he is to take possession before Michaelmas, and some of his servants are to be in the house by the end of next week." "What is his name?" "Bingley." "Is he married or single?" "Oh, single, my dear, to be sure. A single man of large fortune, 4,000 or 5,000 a year. What a fine thing for our girls!" "How so? How can it affect them?" "My dear Mr. Bennet," replied his wife, "how can you be so tiresome? You must know that I am thinking of his marrying one of them." "Is that his design in settling here?" "Design! Nonsense! How can you talk so? But it is very likely that he may fall in love with one of them, and therefore you must visit him as soon as he comes." "I see no occasion for that. You and the girls may go, or you may send them by themselves, which perhaps will still be better, for as you are handsome as any of them, Mr. Bingley might like you the best of the party." "My dear, you flatter me. I certainly have had my share of beauty, but I do not pretend to be anything extraordinary now. When a woman has 5 grown-up daughters, she ought to give over thinking of her own beauty. In such case, a woman has not often much beauty to think of." "But, my dear, you must indeed go and see Mr. Bingley when he comes into the neighborhood." "It is more than I engage for, I assure you." "But consider your daughters. Only think what an establishment it would be for one of them. Sir William and Lady Lucas are determined to go, merely on that account, for in general, you know, they visit no newcomers. Indeed, you must go, for it will be impossible for us to visit him if you do not." "You are overly scrupulous, surely. I dare say Mr. Bingley will be very glad to see you, and I will send a few lines by you to assure him of my hearty consent to his marrying whichever he chooses of the girls, though I must throw in a good word for my little Lizzie." "I desire you will do no such thing. Lizzie is not a bit better than the others, and I am sure she is not half so handsome as Jane, nor half so good humored as Lydia, but you are always giving her the preference." "They have none of them much to recommend them," replied he. "They are all silly and ignorant like other girls. But Lizzie has something more of quickness than her sisters." "Mr. Bennet, how can you abuse your own children in such a way? You take delight in vexing me. You have no compassion on my poor nerves." "You mistake me, my dear. I have a high respect for your nerves. They are my old friends. I have heard you mention them with consideration these 20 years at least." "Ah, you do not know what I suffer." "But I hope you will get over it and live to see many young men of 4,000 a year come into the neighborhood. It will be no use to us if 20 such should come, since you will not visit them." "Depend upon it, my dear, that when there are 20, I will visit them all." Mr. Bennet was so odd a mixture of quick parts, sarcastic humor, reserve, and caprice, that the experience of 23 years had been insufficient to make his wife understand his character. Her mind was less difficult to develop. She was a woman of mean understanding, little information, and uncertain temper. When she was discontented, she fancied herself nervous. The business of her life was to get her daughters married. Its solace was visiting and news. Mr. Bennet was among the earliest of those who waited on Mr. Bingley. He had always intended to visit him, though to the last always assuring his wife that he should not go. Until the evening after the visit was paid, she had no knowledge of it. It was then disclosed in the following manner. Observing his second daughter employed in trimming a hat, he suddenly addressed her with, "I hope Mr. Bingley will like it, Lizzie." "We are not in a way to know what Mr. Bingley likes," said her mother resentfully, "since we are not to visit." "But you forget, Mamma," said Elizabeth, "that we shall meet him at the assemblies, and that Mrs. Long has promised to introduce him." "I do not believe Mrs. Long will do any such thing. She has 2 nieces of her own. She is a selfish, hypocritical woman, and I have no opinion of her." "No more have I," said Mr. Bennet, "and I am glad to find that you do not depend on her serving you." Mrs. Bennet deigned not to make any reply, but unable to contain herself, began scolding one of her daughters. "Don't keep coughing so, Kitty, for heaven's sake. Have a little compassion on my nerves. You tear them to pieces." "Kitty has no discretion in her coughs," said her father. "She times them ill." "I do not cough for my own amusement," replied Kitty fretfully. "When is your next ball to be, Lizzie?" "Tomorrow fortnight." "Aye, so it is," cried her mother, "and Mrs. Long does not come back till the day before, so it will be impossible for her to introduce him, for she will not know him herself." "Then, my dear, you may have the advantage of your friend and introduce Mr. Bingley to her." "Impossible, Mr. Bennet, impossible. When am I not acquainted with him myself? How can you be so teasing?" "I honor your circumstances. A fortnight's acquaintance is certainly very little. One cannot know what a man really is by the end of a fortnight. But if we do not venture, somebody else will. And after all, Mrs. Long and her nieces must stand their chance, and therefore, as she will think it an act of kindness if you decline the office, I will take it on myself." The girls stared at their father. Mrs. Bennet said only, "Nonsense! Nonsense!" "What can be the meaning of that emphatic exclamation?" cried he. "Do you consider the forms of introduction and the stress that is laid on them as nonsense? I cannot quite agree with you there. What say you, Mary? For you are a young lady of deep reflection, I know, and read great books and make extracts." Mary wished to say something very sensible, but knew not how. "While Mary is adjusting her ideas," he continued, "let us return to Mr. Bingley." "I am sick of Mr. Bingley," cried his wife. "I am sorry to hear that. But why did you not tell me so before? If I had known as much this morning, I certainly would not have called on him. It is very unlikely, but as I have actually paid the visit, we cannot escape the acquaintance now." The astonishment of the ladies was just what he wished, that of Mrs. Bennet perhaps surpassing the rest, though when the first tumult of joy was over, she began to declare that it was what she had expected all the while. "How good it was in you, my dear Mr. Bennet! But I knew I should persuade you at last. I was sure you loved your girls too well to neglect such an acquaintance. Well, how pleased I am! And it is such a good joke, too, that you should have gone this morning and never said a word about it till now." "Now, Kitty, you may cough as much as you choose," said Mr. Bennet, and as she spoke, he left the room, fatigued with the raptures of his wife. "What an excellent father you have, girls," said she when the door was shut. "I do not know how you will ever make him amends for his kindness, or me either, for that matter. At our time of life, it is not so pleasant, I can tell you, to be making new acquaintance every day. But for your sakes, we would do anything. Lydia, my love, though you are the youngest, I dare say Mr. Bingley will dance with you at the next ball." "Oh," said Lydia stoutly, "I am not afraid, for though I am the youngest, I am the tallest." The rest of the evening was spent in conjecturing how soon he would return Mr. Bennet's visit and determining when they should ask him to dinner.
And so, Melanie Peters, that's your vote for the Great American Read, or one of your votes for the Great American Read. To tell us what that was. What did you just read to us?
I just read some of the opening chapter of Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen.
So you've cast a major part of your vote. You have another book you'll read tonight, a little bit later, but
Yes.
Our listeners should keep that in mind, that Melanie votes for Pride and Prejudice.
A book that I've read several times. I've also read adaptations, including Pride and Prejudice and Zombies.
Oh, yes.
Which was made into a movie.
Yeah, I got to go see that. Yeah, and there's some wonderful postcard art and that I've really enjoyed very much. And you just got back from England, so you're in the mood.
Yes, I'm steeped in it. I'm steeped in it.
Telling you. Thank you, Melanie. You'll be back with yet another book. And yes, so we're reading chapters from books that are being considered for the Great American Read, a KPBS program that encourages America to look over a list of 100 books and perhaps read all 100 of them. And later there'll be a vote, and that will be the sort of the nationwide book club choice. I've picked one, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer by Mark Twain. And this book is so much different than Melanie's because it's much more colloquial and, the way real people talk. That family, I love the way they talk, though, that family in your book. But in mine, they're in the South, and they don't pull punches. Although the Tom Sawyer book that I have here is not the one with some of the language problems that Huckleberry Finn has. So Mark Twain was a very good choice for a family read. So here's chapter 1 of Mark Twain's The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. Tom! No answer. Tom! No answer. What's gone with that boy, I wonder? Oh, you, Tom! No answer. The old lady pulled her spectacles down and looked over them, about the room. Then she put them up and looked out under them. She seldom or never looked through them for so small a thing as a boy. They were her state pair, the pride of her heart, and they were built for style, not service. She could have seen through a pair of stove lids just as well. She looked perplexed for a moment and then said, not fiercely, but still loud enough for the furniture to hear, "Well, I lay if I get hold of you, I'll—" She did not finish, for by this time she was bending down and punching under the bed with the broom. So she needed to breathe to punctuate the punches with. She resurrected nothing but the cat. "I never did see the beat of that boy." She went to the open door and stood in it and looked out among the tomato vines and the jimson weeds that constituted the garden. No Tom. So she lifted up her voice at an angle calculated for distance and shouted, "You, Tom!" There was a slight noise behind her, and she turned just in time to seize a small boy by the slack of his roundabout and arrest his flight. "There! I might have thought of that closet. What have you been doing there?" "Nothing." "Nothing? Look at your hands. Look at your mouth. What is that truck?" I don't know, Aunt." "Well, I know. It's jam. That's what it is. 40 times I've said if you didn't let that jam alone, I'd skin you. Hand me that switch." The switch hovered in the air. The peril was desperate. "My, look behind you, Aunt." The old lady whirled around and snatched her skirts out of danger. The lad fled on the instant, scrambled up the high board fence, and disappeared over it. His Aunt Polly stood surprised a moment, and then broke into a gentle laugh. "Hang the boy! Can't I never learn anything? Ain't he played me tricks enough like that for me to be looking out for him by this time? Oh, but old fools is the biggest fools there is. Can't learn an old dog new tricks, as the saying is. But my goodness, he never plays them all alike. 2 days, and how is a body to know that's coming? He appears and he knows as if he can make out to put me off for a minute or make me laugh, and it's all down again, and I can't hit him a lick. I ain't doing my duty by that boy, and that's the Lord's truth, goodness knows. Spare the rod and spoil the child, as the good book says. I'm a laying up sin and suffering for us both, I know. He's full of the old scratch. But laws, I mean, he's my own dead sister's boy, poor thing, and I ain't got the heart to lash him somehow. Every time I let him off, my conscience does hurt me so, and every time I hit him, my old heart breaks. Well, man that is born of a woman is of a few days and full of trouble, as the scripture says, and I reckon it's so. He'll play hooky this evening, and I'll be obliged to make him work tomorrow to punish him. It's mighty hard to make him work Saturdays when all the boys is having holiday, but he hates work more than anything he hates else, and I've got to do some of my duty by him, or I'll be the ruination of that child." Tom did play hooky, and he had a very good time. He got back home barely in season to help Jim, the small colored boy, saw next day's wood and split the kindlings before supper. At least he was there in time to tell his adventures to Jim, while Jim did 3/4 of the work. Tom's younger brother, or rather half-brother, Sid, was already through his part of the work, picking up chips, for he was a quiet boy and had no adventurous, troublesome ways. While Tom was eating his supper and stealing sugar as opportunity offered, Aunt Polly asked him questions that were full of guile and very deep, for she wanted to trap him into damaging revealments. Like many other simple-hearted souls, it was her pet vanity to believe she was endowed with a talent for dark and mysterious diplomacy, and she loved to contemplate her most transparent devices as marvels of low cunning. Said she, "Tom, it was middlin' warm in school, warn't it?" "Yes'm." "Powerful warm, warn't it?" "Yes'm." "Didn't you want to go in a-swimming, Tom?" A bit of a scare shot through Tom, a touch of uncomfortable suspicion. He searched Aunt Polly's face, but it told him nothing. So he said, "No, well, not very much." The old lady reached out her hand and felt Tom's shirt and said, "But you ain't too warm now, though." And it flattered her to reflect that she had discovered that the shirt was dry without anybody knowing that that was what she had in her mind. But in spite of her, Tom knew where the wind lay now, so he forestalled what might be the next move. Some of us pumped on our heads. Mine's damp yet, see?" Aunt Polly was vexed to think that she had overlooked that bit of circumstantial evidence and missed a trick. Then she had a new inspiration. "Tom, you didn't have to undo your shirt collar where I sewed it to pump on your head, did you? Unbutton your jacket." The trouble vanished out of Tom's face. He opened his jacket. His shirt collar was securely sewed. "Brother, well, okay, go along with you. I made sure you'd played hooky and been a-swimming. But I forgive you, Tom. I reckon you're kind of a singed cat, as the saying is. Better'n you look this time." She was half sorry her sagacity had miscarried, and half glad that Tom had stumbled into obedient conduct for once. But Sidney said, "Well, now, if I didn't think you sewed his collar with white thread, but it's black." "Why, I did sew it with white, Tom!" But Tom did not wait for the rest. As he went out at the door, he said, "Siddy, I'll lick you for that." In a safe place, Tom examined 2 large needles, which were thrust into the lapels of his jacket, and had thread bound around them. One needle carried white thread, and the other black. He said, "She'd never noticed if it hadn't been for Sid. Consound it. Sometimes she sews it with white, and sometimes she sews it with black. I wish to Jiminy she'd stick with one or the other. I can't keep the run of 'em. But I bet you I'll lamb Sid for that. I'll learn him." He was not the model boy of the village. He knew the model boy very well, though, and loathed him. Within 2 minutes or less, he had forgotten all his troubles. Not because his troubles were one whit less heavy and bitter to him than a man's are to a man, but because a new and powerful interest bore down and drove them out of his mind for the time. Just as men's misfortunes are forgotten in the excitement of new enterprises, this new interest was a valued novelty in whistling, which he had just acquired from a Negro, and he was suffering to practice it undisturbed. It consisted in a peculiar bird-like turn, sort of a liquid warble, produced by touching the tongue to the roof of the mouth at short intervals in the midst of the music. The reader probably remembers how to do it, if he has ever been a boy. Diligence and attention soon gave him the knack of it, and he strode down the street with his mouth full of harmony and his soul full of gratitude. He felt much as an astronomer feels when he's discovered a new planet, no doubt, as far as strong, deep, unalloyed pleasure is concerned. The advantage was with the boy, not the astronomer. The summer evenings were long. It was not dark yet. Presently Tom checked his whistle. A stranger was before him, a boy a shade larger than himself. A newcomer of any age or either sex was an impressive curiosity in the poor little shabby village of St. Petersburg. This boy was well-dressed, too, well-dressed on a weekday. This was simply astounding. His cap was a dainty thing. His close-buttoned blue cloth roundabout was new and natty, and so were his pantaloons. He had shoes on, and it was only Friday. He even wore a necktie, a bright bit of ribbon. He had a citified air about him that ate into Tom's vitals. The more Tom stared at the splendid marvel, the higher he turned up his nose at his finery, and the shabbier and shabbier his own outfit seemed to grow. Neither boy spoke. If one moved, the other moved, but only sideways, in a circle. They kept face to face and eye to eye all the time. Finally, Tom said, "I can lick you." "I'd like to see you try it." "Well, I can do it." "No, you can't either." "Yes, I can." "No, you can't." "I can." "You can't." "Can." "Can't." An uncomfortable pause. Then Tom said, "What's your name?" "'Tisn't any of your business, maybe." "Well, I'll make it my business." "Why don't you?" "If you say much, I will." "Much, much, much." "There now." "Oh, you think you're mighty smart, don't you? I could lick you with one hand tied behind me if I wanted to." "Why don't you do it?" "You say you can do it." "Well, I will, if you fool with me." "Ah, yes, I've seen whole families in the same fix. Smarty, you think you're some now, don't you? Oh, what a hat." "You can lump the hat in if you don't like it. I dare you to knock it off, and nobody that'll take a dare will suck eggs." "You're a liar." "You're another." "You're a fighting liar and doesn't take it up." "Oh, take a walk." "Say, if you give me much more of your sass, I'll take and bounce a rock off your head." "Oh, of course you will." "Well, I will." "Well, why don't you do it then?" "Why don't you keep saying you will for? Why don't you do it?" "It's because you're afraid." "I ain't afraid. You are." "I ain't. You are." Another pause and more eyeing and sidling around each other. Presently they were shoulder to shoulder. Tom said, "Get away from here." "Get away yourself." "I won't." "I won't either." So they stood, each with a foot placed at an angle as a brace, and both shoving with might and main, and glowering at each other with hate. But neither could get an advantage. After struggling till both were hot and flushed, each relaxed his strain with watchful caution, and Tom said, "You're a coward and a pup. I'll tell my big brother on you, and he can thrash you with his little finger, and I'll make him do it, too." "What do I care for your big brother? I've got a big brother that's bigger than he is, and what's more, he can throw him over the fence, too." Both brothers were imaginary. "That's a lie. You're saying so, don't make it so." Tom drew a line in the dust with his big toe and said, "I dare you to step over that, and I'll lick you till you can't stand up. Anybody that'll take a dare will steal sheep." The new boy stepped over promptly and said, "Now you said you'd do it. Now let's see you do it." "Don't you crowd me. Now you better look out." "Well, you said you'd do it. Why don't you do it?" "By jingo, for 2 cents, I will do it." The new boy took broad coppers out of his pocket and held them out with derision. Tom struck them to the ground in an instant. Both boys were rolling and tumbling in the dirt, gripped together like cats. And for the space of a minute they tugged and tore at each other's hair and clothes, punched and scratched each other's noses, and covered themselves with dust and glory. Presently the confusion took form, and through the fog of battle Tom appeared, seated astride the new boy and pounding him with his fists. "Holler 'nuff," he said. The boy only struggled to free himself. He was crying, mainly from rage. "Holler 'nuff," and the pounding went on. At last the stranger got out a smothered "nuff," and Tom let him up and said, "Now that'll learn ye. Better look out who you're fooling with next time." The new boy went off brushing the dust from his clothes, sobbing, snuffling, and occasionally looking back and shaking his head and threatening what he would do to Tom the next time he got caught with him out, to which Tom responded with jeers and started off in high feather. And as soon as his back was turned, the new boy snatched up a stone, threw it, and hit him between the shoulders, and then turned tail and ran like an antelope. Tom chased the traitor home, and thus found out where he lived. He then held a position at the gate for some time, daring the enemy to come outside, but the enemy only made faces at him through the window and declined. At last the enemy's mother appeared, and called Tom a bad, vicious, vulgar child, and ordered him away, so he went away. But he said he'd allowed to lay for that boy. He got home pretty late that night, and when he climbed cautiously in at the window, he uncovered an ambuscade in the person of his aunt. And when she saw the state of his clothes, wherein her resolution to turn his Saturday holiday into captivity and hard labor became adamantine in its firmness. I had to look up that word adamantine. It means diamond-like. That was chapter 1.
He was wearing shoes, and it wasn't even Friday.
There's just one little bit I want to read without it being a spoiler. This is the conclusion to The Adventures of Tom Sawyer by Mark Twain. And it's only 2 super short paragraphs long. Here's the conclusion. And basically this conclusion promises that there won't be a sequel, but as you know, there was a sequel, and it was entitled The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Mm-hmm. Well, anyway, here's that 2-paragraph conclusion. So endeth this chronicle. It being strictly a history of a boy, it must stop here. The story could go much further without becoming the history of a man. It could not go much further without becoming the history of a man. When one writes a novel about grown people, he knows exactly where to stop. That is, with a marriage. But when he writes of juveniles, he must stop where best he can. Most of the characters that perform in this book still live and are prosperous and happy. Someday it may seem worthwhile to take up the story of the younger ones again and see what sort of men and women they turned out to be. Therefore, it will be wisest not to reveal any of that part of their lives at present. The end. Well, that wasn't a spoiler, but there you go. And, yeah, so, wow. I don't think I ever really read Tom Sawyer. Maybe I was supposed to, and didn't. You know how that happens sometimes.
Right.
But boy, what a great read, and such real dialogue, and I'm so glad that this is being considered as one of the 100 books that America votes on as they choose the Great American Read, a program that PBS is sponsoring.
I love how these books, it's wonderful to listen to them, and they were meant to be listened to. They were reading these books out loud was a family, event.
Yes. And, this program, the Great American Read, there's a lot of posters and that school people and families can print out to encourage you. And there are some wonderful statistics about, those who are read to as children really keep that joy of reading in their lives. And apparently there have been some studies showing that those who really do read and continue to read just fare so much better in life, and especially in old age. Not that we're getting there.
No.
And the youthful and dewy Barbara Henderson is here.
Thank you, Scott. I love that segue.
You've picked something from that list of 100 books, The Great American Read, as well. What have you picked?
I've picked Little Women. It's probably my sentimental favorite as a vote. I'm not sure. Reading it just in preparation for this evening, I realized I probably haven't read it in decades again. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if it will hold the test of time. I suspect it has to, because it's stayed in my memory for such a long time as a book I loved.
Well, perhaps here at Aethertail Radio Theater, we're acting as your parole officer now and forcing you to read, which is wonderful.
I actually will.
And we'd love to hear, are you reading the first chapter maybe?
I'm reading part of the first chapter.
Excellent. Yeah. And if you could get closer to the microphone, I'll put extra money in your envelope if you get closer to the microphone, Miss Barbara. Thank you.
This is Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. Chapter 1, Playing Pilgrims. Christmas won't be Christmas without any presents, grumbled Joe, lying on the rug. It's so dreadful to be poor, sighed Meg, looking down at her old dress. I don't think it's fair for some girls to have plenty of pretty things and other girls nothing at all, added little Amy with an injured sniff. We've got father and mother and each other, said Beth contentedly from her corner. The 4 young faces, on which the firelight shone, brightened at the cheerful words, but darkened again as Joe said sadly, We haven't got father, and shall not have him for a long time. She didn't say, perhaps never, but each silently added it, thinking of father far away where the fighting was. Nobody spoke for a minute. Then Meg said in an altered tone, You know, the reason Mother proposed not having any presents this Christmas was because it is going to be a hard winter for everyone, and she thinks we ought not to spend money for pleasure when our men are suffering so in the army. We can't do much, but we can make our little sacrifices, and ought to do it gladly. But I'm afraid I don't. and Meg shook her head as she thought regretfully of all the pretty things she wanted. "But I don't think the little we should spend would do any good. We've each got $1, and the army wouldn't be much helped by our giving that. I agree not to expect anything from Mother or you, but I do want to buy Undine and Cintran for myself. I've wanted it so long," said Joe, who was a bookworm. "I plan to spend mine in new music," said Beth with a little sigh, which no one heard but the hearth brush and kettle holder. "I shall get a nice box of Faber's drawing pencils. I really need them," said Amy decidedly. "Mother didn't say anything about our money, and she won't wish us to give up everything. Let's each buy what we want and have a little fun. I'm sure we work hard enough to earn it," cried Joe, examining the heels of her shoes in a gentlemanly manner. "I know I do, teaching those tiresome children nearly all day when I'm longing to enjoy myself at home," began Meg, in the complaining tone again. "You don't have half such a hard time as I do," said Joe. "How would you like to be shut up for hours with a nervous, fussy old lady who keeps you trotting, is never satisfied, and worries you till you're ready to fly out the window or cry?" "It's naughty to fret, but I do think washing dishes and keeping things tidy is the worst work in the world. It makes me cross, and my hands get so stiff I can't practice well at all." And Beth looked at her rough hands with a sigh that anyone could hear that time. "I don't believe any of you suffer as I do," cried Amy, "for you don't have to go to school with impertinent girls who plague you if you don't know your lessons, and laugh at your dresses, and label your father if he isn't rich, and insult you when your nose isn't nice." "If you mean libel, I'd say so and not talk about labels as if Papa was a pickle bottle," advised Joe, laughing. "I know what I mean, and you needn't be satirical about it. It's proper to use good words and improve your vocabulary," returned Amy with dignity. "Don't peck at one another, children. Don't you wish we had the money Papa lost when we were little, Joe? Dear me, how happy and good we'd be if we had no worries," said Meg, who could remember better times. "You said the other day you thought we were a great deal happier than the King children, for they were fighting and fretting all the time in spite of their money." "So I did, Beth. Well, I think we are. For though we do have to work, we make fun of ourselves and are a pretty jolly set, as Joe would say." "Joe does use such slang words," observed Amy with a reproving look at the long figure stretched on the rug. Joe immediately sat up, put her hands in her pocket, and began to whistle. "Don't, Joe. It's so boyish. That's why I do it. I detest rude, unladylike girls. I hate affected niminy-piminy chits." "Birds in their little nests agree," sang Beth the peacemaker, with such a funny face that both sharp voices softened to a laugh, and the pecking ended for that time. "Really, girls, you are both to be blamed," said Meg, beginning to lecture in her elderly sister fashion. "You are old enough to leave off boyish tricks and to behave better, Josephine. It didn't matter so much when you were a little girl, but now you are so tall and turn up your hair, you should remember that you are a young lady. I'm not, and if turning up my hair makes me one, I'll wear it in 2 tails till I'm 20, cried Joe, pulling off her net and shaking down a chestnut mane. "I hate to think I've got to grow up and be Miss March and wear long gowns and look as prim as a china aster. It's bad enough to be a girl anyway when I like boys' games and work and manners. I can't get over my disappointment in not being a boy, and it's worse than ever now, for I'm dying to go and fight with Papa, and I can only stay home and knit like a poky old woman." And Joe shook the blue army sock till the needles rattled like castanets, and her ball bounded across the room. "Poor Joe. It's so bad, but it can't be helped. So you must try to be contented with making your name boyish and playing brother to us girls," said Beth, stroking the rough head with a hand that all the dishwashing and dusting in the world could not make ungentle in its touch. "As for you, Amy," continued Meg, "you are altogether too particular and prim. Your airs are funny now, but you'll grow up an affected little goose if you don't take care. I like your nice manners and refined ways of speaking, when you don't try to be elegant, but your absurd words are as bad as Joe's slang. If Joe is a tomboy and Amy a goose, what am I, please? Asked Beth, ready to share the lecture. You're a dear and nothing else, answered Meg warmly, and no one contradicted her, for the mouse was the pet of the family. As young readers like to know how people look, we will take this moment to give them a little sketch of the four sisters, who sat knitting away in the twilight while the December snow fell quietly without and the fire crackled cheerfully within. It was a comfortable room, though the carpet was faded and the furniture very plain, for a good picture or two hung on the walls, books filled the recesses, chrysanthemums and Christmas roses bloomed in the windows, and a pleasant atmosphere of home peace pervaded it. Margaret, the eldest of the four, was 16, and very pretty, being plump and fair, with large eyes, plenty of soft brown hair, a sweet mouth, and white hands, of which she was rather vain. 15-year-old Joe was very tall, thin, and brown, and reminded one of a colt, for she never seemed to know what to do with her long limbs, which were very much in her way. She had a decided mouth, a comical nose, and sharp gray eyes, which appeared to see everything and were, by turns, fierce, funny, or thoughtful. Her long, thick hair was her one beauty, but it was usually bundled into a net to be out of her way. Round shoulders had Joe, big hands and feet, a flyaway look to her clothes, and the uncomfortable appearance of a girl who was rapidly shooting up into a woman and didn't like it. Elizabeth, or Beth as everyone called her, was a rosy, smooth-haired, bright-eyed girl of 13, with a shy manner, a timid voice, and a peaceful expression which was seldom disturbed. Her father called her Little Miss Tranquility, and the name suited her excellently, for she seemed to live in a happy world of her own, only venturing out to meet the few whom she trusted and loved. Amy, though the youngest, was a most important person in her own opinion, at least. A regular snow maiden with blue eyes and yellow hair curling on her shoulders, pale and slender, and always carrying herself like a young lady mindful of her manners. What the characters of the four sisters were, we will leave to be found out.
Thank you for that flawless reading, even when I pushed the microphone in your face.
Thank you. I didn't realize I was slipping to one side there.
But I'm worried about Beth.
Oh,
Should I be?
gosh.
And somehow
gosh.
I'm worried about her beautiful long hair too. Should I be? It's funny how
Yes.
you don't realize that the foreshadowing is there, but it is. Oh, no spoilers. No spoilers. Thank you for endorsing that. Well, again, what is it? What did you just read for us, Miss Barbara
Little
Henderson?
Women by Louisa May Alcott.
And that's Barbara Henderson's vote for the Great American Read, a program that KPBS is sponsoring. They're asking America to consider 100 books and to choose from those 100 books the item that will become, I guess, the book for a nationwide book club read. And television programs start later in May, where celebrities are endorsing, like celebrities like Barbara Henderson, are endorsing certain books, and that's a keeper. That sure is. And Melanie, I think you have one more reading for us, and I think we have time for it too.
We should.
Yes, especially if I stop talking now, and if you could please tell us, what is this book entitled to be titled?
This book is titled to be titled Great Expectations by Charles Dickens, and I very selfishly chose this when you said, hey, what would you like to read? Because I was recently in London, and there is a pub that is part of the National Trust, but is still a pub called the George, and it's a pub that Dickens stayed at. It's a pub that shows up in Little Dorrit, and it's one of the only surviving carriage inns where people would actually ride up in their horses. And in this chapter of Great Expectations, he mentions not the George, but a type of carriage inn.
And if we're fortunate, and if Wade has set us up with an hour-long show, you'll now be able to read this selection.
The tidings of my high fortunes having had a heavy fall had gone down to my native place in its neighborhood. Before I got there, I found the blue boar in possession of the intelligence, and I found that it made a great change in the boar's demeanor. Whereas the boar had cultivated my good opinion with warm assiduity when I was coming into property, the boar was exceedingly cool on the subject now that I was going out of property. It was evening when I arrived, much fatigued by the journey I had so often made so easily. The boar could not put me into my usual bedroom, which was engaged, probably by someone who had expectations, and could only assign me a very indifferent chamber among the pigeons and post-chaises up the yard. But I had as sound a sleep in that lodging as in the most superior accommodation the boar could have given me, and the quality of my dreams was about the same as in the best bedroom. Early in the morning, while my breakfast was getting ready, I strolled round the Satis house. There were printed bills on the gate and on bits of carpet hanging out of the windows, announcing a sale by auction of the household furniture and effects next week. The house itself was to be sold as old building materials and pulled down. Lot 1 was marked in whitewashed knock-kneed letters on the brew house. Lot 2 on that part of the main building which had been so long shut up. Other lots were marked off on other parts of the structure, and the ivy had been torn down to make room for the inscriptions, and much of it trailed low in the dust and was withered already. Stepping in for a moment at the open gate and looking round me with the uncomfortable air of a stranger who had no business there, I saw the auctioneer's clerk walking on the casks and telling them off for the information of a catalog compiler, pen in hand, who made a temporary desk of the wheeled chair I had so often pushed along the tune of Old Clem. When I got back to my breakfast in the boar's coffee room, I found Mr. Pumblechook conversing with the landlord. Mr. Pumblechook, not improved in appearance by his late nocturnal adventure, was waiting for me and addressed me in the following terms. "Young man, I am sorry to see you brought low, but what else could be expected? What else could be expected?" As he extended his hand with a magnificently forgiving air, and as I was broken by illness and unfit to quarrel, I took it. "William," said Mr. Pumblechook to the waiter, "put a muffin on a table. And it has come to this. Has it come to this?" I frowningly sat down to my breakfast. Mr. Pumblechook stood over me and poured out my tea before I could touch the teapot, with the air of a benefactor who was resolved to be true to the last. "William," said Mr. Pumblechook mournfully, "put the salt on." In happier times, addressing me, "I think you took sugar, and did you take milk?" "You did. Sugar and milk. William, bring a watercress." "Thank you," I said shortly, "but I don't eat watercress." "You don't eat 'em," returned Mr. Pumblechook, sighing and nodding his head several times as if he might have expected that, and as if abstinence from watercress were consistent with my downfall. "True, the simple fruits of the earth. No, you needn't bring any, William." I went on with my breakfast, and Mr. Pumblechook continued to stand over me, staring fishily and breathing noisily as he always did. "Little more than skin and bone," mused Mr. Pumblechook aloud, "and yet when he went away from here, I may say with my blessing, and I spread before him my humble store like the bee, he was as plump as a peach." This reminded me of the wonderful difference between the servile manner in which he had offered his hand in my new prosperity, saying, "May I?" and the ostentatious clemency with which he had just now exhibited the same fat 5 fingers. "Ha!" he went on, handing me the bread and butter, "and ere you a-going to Joseph?" "In heaven's name," said I, firing in spite of myself, "what does it matter to you where I am going? Leave that teapot alone." It was the worst course I could have taken, because it gave Pumblechook the opportunity he wanted. "Yes, young man," said he, releasing the handle of the article in question, retiring a step or two from my table, and speaking for the behoof of the landlord and waiter at the door, "I will leave that teapot alone. You are right, young man. For once you are right. I forget myself when I take such an interest in your breakfast as to wish your frame, exhausted by the debilitating effects of prodigality, to be stimulated by the wholesome nourishment of your forefathers. And yet," said Pumblechook, turning to the landlord and waiter and pointing me out at arm's length. "This is him as I ever sported with in his days of happy infancy. Tell me not it cannot be. I tell you this is him." A low murmur from the two replied. The waiter appeared to be particularly affected. "This is him," said Pumblechook, "as I have rode in my shay-cart. This is him as I have seen brought up by hand. This is him unto the sister of which I was uncle by marriage, as her name was Georgina Maria, from her own mother. Let him deny it if he can." The waiter seemed convinced that I could not deny it, and that gave him the case a black look. "Young man," said Pumblechook, screwing his head at me in the old fashion, "you air a-goin' to Joseph. What does it matter to me, you ask me, where you air a-goin'? I say to you, sir, you air a-goin' to Joseph." The waiter coughed, as if he modestly invited me to get over that. "Now," said Pumblechook, and all this with the most exasperating air of saying in the cause of virtue what was perfectly convincing and conclusive, "I will tell you what to say to Joseph. Here is Squires of the Boar present, known and respected in this town, and here is William, which his father's name was Potkins, if I do not deceive myself." "You do not, sir," said William. "In their presence," pursued Pumblechook, "I will tell you, young man, what to say to Joseph. Says you, Joseph, I have this day seen my earliest benefactor and the founder of my fortunes. I will name no names, Joseph, but so they are pleased to call him uptown, and I have seen that man." "I swear I don't see him here," said I. "Say that likewise," retorted Pumblechook. "Say you said that, and even Joseph will probably betray surprise." "There you quite mistake him," I said. "I know better." "Says you," Pumblechook went on, "Joseph, I have seen that man, and that man bears you no malice and bears me no malice. He knows your character, Joseph, and is well acquainted with your pig-headedness and ignorance, and he knows my character, Joseph, and he knows my want of gratitude. Yes, Joseph, says you." Here Pumblechook shook his head and hand at me. "He knows my total deficiency of common human gratitude. He knows it, Joseph, as none can. You do not know it, Joseph, having no call to know it, but that man do." Windy donkey as he was, it really amazed me that he could have the face to talk thus to mine. "Says you, Joseph, he gave me a little message, which I will now repeat. It was that in my being brought low, he saw the finger of Providence. He knowed that finger when he saw it, Joseph, and he saw it plain. It pinted out this writing, Joseph, reward of ingratitude to earliest benefactor and founder of fortunes. But that man said that he did not repent of what he had done, Joseph. Not at all. It was right to do it. It was kind to do it. It was benevolent to do it, and he would do it again." "It's a pity," said I scornfully as I finished my interrupted breakfast, "that the man did not say what he had done and would do again." "Squires of the Boar," Pumblechook was now addressing the landlord, "and William, I have no objections to you mentioning either uptown or downtown, if such should be your wishes, that it was right to do it, kind to do it, benevolent to do it, and that I would do it again." With those words, this impostor shook them both by the hand with an air and left the house, leaving me much more astonished than delighted by the virtues of that same indefinite it. I was not going after him and leaving the house, too, and when I went down the high street, I saw him holding forth, no doubt to the same effect, at his shop door to a select group, who honored me with very unfavorable glances as I had passed on the opposite side of the way.
And that's probably all we have time for tonight. People need to read this book that one of the two books that you're recommending for the Great American Read, Great Expectations. By whom?
Charles Dickens.
That's Melanie's vote, one of her votes. So thank you so much, Barbara Henderson and Melanie Peters, for joining me this evening as we read some of our favorite chapters from our favorite books to celebrate this great American read. I wonder who's going to win. It's not going to be 50 Shades of Grey.
Oh gosh, I hope not. Please no.
But it could be The Color Purple.
Oh, that would be
yes. So and it could be Frankenstein. Who knows? Good night, everybody. I'm Scott Paulson. Isn't that who I am?
That's who you are. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
A podcast or radio show on WS Radio is a great way to create content marketing. Turn prospects into customers into raving fans. Contact Wade at WSRadio.com or call 866-WS-RADIO.
Controversy and conversation to upset the status quo. A no-holds-barred exploration and obliteration of the limits of possibility. Join me, Steve Olsher, and my rambunctious crew on Reinvention Radio, where each week we scour the planet to bring you the world's foremost social, business, political, technology, and scientific disruptors who challenge the accepted and forge daring, cutting-edge paths. That's Reinvention Radio, where normal comes to die and mediocrity meets its final demise.
Kenja Dixon was crowned the #1 sales executive through hard work, deep thinking, and the revelation of universal talk laws. He now wants to share these lessons with you. Universal talk laws are what you need to know and use in business and at home to have successful and effective conversations. Kenja Dixon shares his wisdom, action plans, and wealth. Each book comes with a chance to win $10,000. Find Universal Talk Laws at KenjaDixon.com. On the internet, your business's reputation can be unjustly destroyed in an instant. Don't wait for that to happen. Building and marketing your 5-star reputation can increase your business by as much as 19%. Take control of your reputation and have the 5-star reputation you deserve with Reputation Marketing Solutions by DSI Development. Become the go-to company by visiting 5starrepmarketing.com. The number 5starrepmarketing.com.
Hi, Scale listener. This is David Finkel, co-host with Jeff Hoffman of Scale Your Business. I wanted to let you know that our newest book, Scale, was just released and to encourage you to get your copy. The book will give you 7 proven principles to grow your business and get your life back. If you've ever wanted to grow your business, but held yourself back from fear that it would take over your life, then we urge you to get your copy of Scale today. It'll give you a proven roadmap for rapidly growing your business while also gaining more personal freedom. Scale will help you work less by getting your business to produce more. Scale is for every entrepreneur who ever wondered if they really own their business or if their business owns them. Get your copy online or at your local bookseller. For more information, visit us online at scaleyourbusinesstoolkit.com. That's scaleyourbusinesstoolkit.com.
Hi, this is Rob Barnett, VinVillage.com, where wine lovers connect. Be sure to tune in weekly to Vin Village Radio for exclusive, in-depth interviews with the who's who in wine and food.